Hello and welcome to another instalment of History Hacks. Zach is very excited today because he's found us a fabulous guest, haven't you?
I absolutely have. If folks were living under a rock back in March, then perhaps they didn't notice all the news headlines and the Twitter memes that went out when a massive container ship got wedged sideways in the Suez Canal. But if folks think that that's a crisis, that's nothing compared to what we're discussing today. We're bringing you a proper Suez crisis, specifically the one from 1956. Joining us to make sense of it all is Adrian Smith, Emeritus Professor of Modern History at the University of Southampton, who's written a number of books, including on World War I fighter pilot Mick Mannock, on Lord Mountbatten, and the history of sport. In 2018, he published an authorised biography of the aviation pioneer Sir Richard Fairey, and last year he published Slouching Towards Big Pink, essays on Bob Dylan and the band, Woody Guthrie, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He's also my former lecturer from Southampton and is without question the most enthused individual that I've ever had the privilege to meet. Adrian, it's great to have you on. How are you doing?
Fine, thanks, Zach, and thank you very much to you and Alex for inviting me on. Yeah.
I cannot believe that what with the Mick Mannock connection, although I'm more of a McCudden girl, and the Mountbattens and everything, that we have not crossed paths before.
Right, well, I'm impressed that you're a McCudden girl, yeah.
My first ever TV appearance was Falling Aces about Mannock and McCudden. So
right, well, I'm on that.
We probably both. Did you go to the screening at the Royal Aero Club?
I did, yeah, with my.
Yeah, so did I. I was hiding at the back with Peter Hart in case anyone asked any technical aeroplane questions. And Josh Levine. We were slouching in our chairs.
That's very strange because I was thinking, it looks very familiar. I think we met that night.
We went to the pub, didn't we?
I now have a clear recollection of the conversation that we had after the screening.
Oh, I was a baby, but I think we all adjourned to the pub. Right, and Peter Hart was obsessed with my boyfriend at the time's iPhone because it could give him cricket scores.
Right. Well, I didn't go to the pub, but I can remember sort of sipping warm white wine and you and I having a conversation.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Zach is kind of looking like, what have I started getting these two together? He had no idea this passion was going to appear.
We must get back to Sue. Yeah.
See, I open by saying that Adrian is the most enthused person that I've ever met, and this is exactly what I mean. You can just talk about anything historically related, and suddenly you get a tour de force like this. But as you say, we should take it back to Suez. Let's start by giving people a sense of the background. How does the Suez Canal, and particularly the Franco-British owned Suez Canal Company, come into being?
Well, the Suez Canal is essentially a French initiative. And it's very much a consequence of the move in the 19th century from sail to steam. So it only really makes sense when you've got an alternative to wind for powering ships. And of course, it's so we're in the middle of the 19th century. It's a great age of engineering, and a French engineer called Ferdinand de Lesseps puts forward this proposal for linking the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and the distance is actually very short. I mean, as the crow flies, it's only about 120 miles. But the canal itself, as it's constructed, is actually longer than that because the advantage that the French engineers and the Egyptian workforce had was that there are a number of lakes, of which the biggest lakes, the Bitter Lakes, between the two seas. So basically, you were linking up lakes, and then the canal made up the rest of the passageway. And it took 10 years because you can imagine that there's only limited technology available at the time. So heavily reliant on poorly paid labour. So it's very much a French-Egyptian initiative in the first instance, and it's completed by 1869. Then the first of a succession of projects to modernise and improve the canal takes place in 1876, 6. And by that time, the British had become involved because the year before, 1875, essentially the Egyptian government went bust. And a way of which they could generate revenue was to sell their share in the Suez Canal Company. So it's often overlooked the fact that initially it was a Franco-Egyptian enterprise, but it's much better known then as a Franco-English or Anglo-French company, which is how then it through the decades, it goes all the way down to the 1950s. And just looking ahead beyond the crisis that we're going to talk about, when the canal's been blocked prior to last week was in 56, 57, and that's, as I say, topic of today's conversation, but also then in from the period 1967, the time of the Six-Day War between Israel and surrounding Arab countries, particularly Egypt, and all the way through to 1975. And it was at that point that a combination of further modernization of the canal and final unblocking of the canal enabled it to reopen, and also had to be seen against the backdrop of an improvement growing improvement between the Egyptians and the Israelis. But prior to that, there of course had been a further conflict, further war in 1973, the Yom Kippur War. And what that highlighted was the way in which historically the Suez Canal could act as a barrier, because that the Israelis stormed it, and I think if my memory serves right, they did actually cross the canal, but then were rebuffed in 73. And the previous occasion on which it had acted effectively as a barrier was back during the First World War, between 1914 through to 1916, 1917, when you had the British in Egypt and you had the enemy, the Ottoman forces, the other side of the canal, and then eventually the British in this massive logistical exercise under General Allenby cross the Suez Canal, and then they begin their advance north into Palestine and all the way up, and you see the eventual defeat of the Turks. So there's an awful lot of history wrapped up in the Suez Canal. A lot of it linked to conflict, and it's a particular conflict, obviously, that we want to focus on today.
Absolutely. Before we do, though, let's just outline. There are some incredible personalities in this story. Right, okay, Dickie, who I always think only doesn't look quite as awful as he may well have been, because he's usually standing next to the Duke of Windsor. But his involvement in the crisis, how does he get involved? Because a lot of people associate him either with his naval career or being the last Viceroy of India, and basically, I guess, what they've seen in The Crown.
Yes, well, Mountbatten's involved because he's the first Sea Lord, so he's Chief of the Naval Staff, and he's been that for just under a year at this point. And he's in an unusual position because of, he has close royal connections, and also because it's not the first time he's been a Chief of Staff, because he's been Chief of Combined Operations in the war, and then he was Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia, and then he goes back to the Navy briefly to resume his naval career. So he goes back to a junior rank, and then, of course, most famously, he becomes the last Viceroy of India. So he's Viceroy of India, and then he stays on in India after partition. Initially, he anticipated being Governor General, because don't forget, at this point, they're not republics, Pakistan and India, they're still dominions. Being Governor General of both Pakistan and of India. But in fact, Jinnah, sort of seen as the founding father of Pakistan, becomes Governor General of Pakistan. But Mountbatten stays on for quite a sort of controversial year, much of it focused on the crisis in Kashmir, until 1948. And it's at that point that he properly resumes his naval career. And his great ambition is to become Chief of Naval Staff, to become First Sea Lord, which is what his father, Prince Louis Battenberg, held in 1914. And then famously was forced to resign because of anti-German sentiment. Here he is now, he's First Sea Lord, and at the same time as he's becoming head of the Navy, then there's a change of administration because Churchill resigns, and finally, belatedly, the great heir apparent, the Dauphin, who's been waiting for years and years and years to become Prime Minister, is Anthony Eden. And Eden, of course, along with the Egyptian leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, these are the two key protagonists in 1956. But Mountbatten's important because he's the chief of staff who, he doesn't go public at the time, he certainly does later, but during this key period is in this unusual position where he's ultra professional, he prepares the Navy, he's heavily involved in the planning, he doesn't do anything to disrupt the operational efficiency of the Navy and the Marines, but he's actually opposed, fundamentally opposed to any military intervention because he thinks that it will have negative consequences across the Commonwealth, particularly in South Asia, and it will turn out to be extraordinarily damaging for Britain in terms of international opinion. And that's why he's especially significant. And later, of course, because he's the great self-publicist, when he's talking about his various achievements and, what he's done in the course of his life and his career, he very often talks about Suez. He, as he always did, he's continually rewriting history, telling a fresh story at which his importance and his influence becomes that much greater every time. So that's very much a mark of his retirement. And because of that fuels an antagonism between him and Eden. If you go back before the Second World War, Mountbatten's an anti-appeaser. And Eden, of course, is a slightly half-hearted anti-appeaser after he resigns as Foreign Secretary. So they have this in common, and they actually, they got on pretty well. But this, 1956, the Suez Crisis marks a break. While Mountbatten afterwards always tries to claim that everybody gets on all right and he gets on fine with Eden, Eden loathed him. He absolutely loathed him. And even when Eden was dying in 1976, he died of cancer later that year, and they met the Order of the Garter ceremony at Windsor, and Mountbatten is trying to be emollient, then Eden is still basically telling him where to get off. There's an extraordinarily sort of deep, passionate loathing. And of course, that's an aspect of Eden because there's someone else he had a deep, passionate loathing for, and that was the president of Egypt, Nasser.
Well, tell us a little bit more then about Eden and Nasser and their individual personalities and experiences. Because as you say, Eden was for such a long time that heir apparent to Churchill. Probably could have done with Churchill resigning much sooner and therefore sort of had his time as PM, as opposed to what we actually got with Eden as PM. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, let's start with Eden and then move to Nasser. Eden is a very glamorous figure, and he's very successful at a young age. He looked great, and he famously resigned in February of 1938 over various aspects of foreign policy as, in effect, controlled by Neville Chamberlain. That's about relations, two things really, relations with the United States and relations with fascist Italy and Mussolini. So that worked to his advantage in that, as I hinted at earlier, he was a slightly half-hearted anti-appeaser, although he was surrounded by various backbenchers who were known as the glamour boys, most of whom were much more committed to opposing government foreign policy than Eden was. So, but anyway, he comes back into government at the start of the Second World War, and then in the Churchill coalition, soon he becomes, in December of 1940, becomes Foreign Secretary again, so into his second period. And a sort of partnership of him and the Permanent Secretary of the Foreign Office, Alexander Cadogan, are a formidable duo during the war. And Britain is blessed, really, throughout the whole of the 1940s in having two outstanding foreign secretaries from both major parties, Eden, first of all, and then Ernest Bevin. And there is a continuity across the 40s as well, because Eden is a sort of tacit supporter of Bevin's sort of, a role in the formation of NATO. So Eden stays out, is clearly still a high-profile figure. He's regarded by almost everybody as being the natural heir to Churchill, although Churchill has his reservations, but he doesn't sort of air them except to his closest confidants. But then, as you said, Churchill comes back to power. The Conservatives come back to power in the autumn of 1951 for the Attlee government of 45-51. And, Eden is just waiting. He's waiting and Churchill, even when Churchill has strokes and he's seriously ill and he's debilitated and it's hidden from the public, he doesn't go. But what Eden does, meanwhile, is again prove his worth as a foreign secretary. So 1954 is a really important year for Eden, for a variety of reasons I won't go into, but it confirms his credentials as one of the great foreign secretaries of the 20th century, along with Bevin and Sir Edward Grey. But he's still waiting. But there's been one absolutely crucial development in this time, that whereas Eden had always come across as being fit, healthy, good-looking, youthful, his health has deteriorated sharply, and he's had to have a succession of operations, one of which goes spectacularly wrong, involving his bile duct and his bladder. And from then on, and that it takes place in America, and he comes back and he's clearly not well. And from then on, he becomes heavily dependent on a whole host of forms of medication. And he's not the same man. So physically, he's not, and obviously mentally and emotionally, he's not. He's a happier man in one respect, in that despite, sadly, the death of his son in 1945 in Burma, when Mountbatten was extraordinarily supportive in trying to find out what had happened to his son, despite the death of his son, he's married again, and he's married now Clarissa Eden. So there's a further sort of Churchill connection there. Lady Eden, who is still alive today. So he's happier in terms of his marriage, but his health has deteriorated markedly, and he always had quite a sharp temper, and now, boom, it just takes a trigger, boom, he's away. Okay, so that's Eden. And Eden, when he was still Foreign Secretary, was in the Middle East, and he went to Cairo, and he met the new president, the member of the sort of military conspirators, cum junta, which had overseen the deposition of King Farouk and the end of the monarchy and Egypt becoming a republic. And they met in 1954, 55, can't remember. But anyway, it was a disaster. It was a complete disaster. And so these two men really were left after their one encounter, even more antagonistic towards each other. But for Eden had to make the arrangements that have been agreed with Egypt and had been turned into a treaty about handing over control of the Suez Canal. He had to make it work. So just to recap, just very slightly, when he was Foreign Secretary, much to Churchill's, quiet opposition, Eden had negotiated a treaty with the new regime in Egypt, which handed over control of the Suez Canal area, all the area around it, territorial, which had been controlled by the British. So the British, after the Second World War, moved out of, obviously once the war was over, they didn't need to have any sort of, huge military presence within the rest of Egypt, well, they did have in Libya. And so they concentrated all the forces, a large number of troops in the canal zone. And so Eden had negotiated to withdraw the troops, and that there was a long-term agreement over continuing Anglo-French control of the canal. One thing, this is really pertinent to how Eden behaves in 1956. A large number of conservative backbenchers are deeply antagonistic to this, and they know that Churchill is as well. So it's a bit like when the Conservatives tacitly support Indian independence in 1947. A whole host of them are, including Churchill, really are opposed to it. It's the same thing with what they see as a further withdrawal from empire, from the canal zone. So here we have the situation by 1956, where we have a new prime minister under considerable pressure at home, even though he's only been in office for a short space of time, because the economy is in trouble as well. His backbenchers are unhappy. And then in Egypt, we have a nationalist, pan-Arab leader in Nasser who's keen to encourage Arab nationalism across the whole of the Middle East and North Africa, and to take actions which show that Egypt will be the leader of those nationalist forces. And the final thing to say on this is a manifestation of that is the support that the Egyptians are giving to the Front de Libération Nationale. Right? So in Algeria, the FLN since 1954 has been conducting a war of independence. It's out in the desert, in the Bled, but also then in 55, 56 in Algiers itself. So this war is becoming ever more violent, ever more bloody, and the French are determined to win because, of course, they've been forced out of Indochina. So these are tough, ruthless, brutal elite forces, Paras particularly, and French Foreign Legion, who are fighting in Algeria, and the Egyptians are supporting the enemy of the French, the Front de Libération Nationale, and that feeds into the Suez crisis.
So the crisis itself begins with Nasser taking the decision to nationalise the canal company. In practice, how does that work? Because this is a privately owned company, lots of French investors, the British government has a stake, and there's already been an agreement that the company would be handed back to the Egyptian government in 1968. So how do we get here? And is this a bit of a pirate-esque move by Nasser?
Well, Nasser, it's brilliantly done. In July 1956, and it's actually captured quite well in The Crown. That Nasser gives a speech, and there's a key phrase in the speech which is a trigger for Egyptian forces to take over control. So it's done incredibly smoothly. And the British learn of it late at night in Downing Street, and Eden summons the chiefs of staff, and that's a story you might want to pursue in a moment. But in terms of the actual Nasser's justification, he pointed to the fact that that there were plenty of examples around the world, not least in Britain after the Second World War, of governments taking ownership of a public utility. And in this case, it was the Suez Canal. He argued that there would be compensation for the Anglo-French company, that the canal would continue to be run efficiently, but now the considerable fees that were generated from ships passing through the canal would help support the Egyptian economy and improve the standard of living and quality of life of ordinary Egyptians. And he in the weeks that passed, he played the game brilliantly. So he played for time, and also, he was quite happy to go through all sorts of international mechanisms for seeking some sort of settlement, right? So the whole time he sort of tried to portray himself as, if you like, the man of peace, as opposed to Eden and the French Prime Minister Mollet, who are already taking steps, as I'm sure we'll talk about in a moment, to create, military a task force for possible military intervention. Nasser sort of plays all this down. I'm sure this can all be settled, and he knows that the longer it goes on, the harder it will be for the British and the French to take any action, because in effect it's become a fait accompli, and that, of course, is how it panned out, so playing for time. And he also knew that the longer it went on, then the further it got into the year, if you managed to get through the summer and still nothing had happened, then the more it got towards the end of the year, the more weather conditions would deteriorate, the harder it would be to launch a military operation. That would take you through into the next year, and he was there really. So, and of course, the French and the British were well aware of the fact that he was playing for time, but because he had the advantage of a clear shift of mood that was taking place globally in the 1950s. That these sort of profound nationalist anti-colonial forces that were emerging and were particularly evident in the General Assembly of the United Nations, and which were, surprising though it might seem, which had been historically encouraged by the United States, especially while Roosevelt was still alive, of course. And we got the Atlantic Charter and all this. So the Americans, as the Cold War is intensifying, don't want to find themselves exposed in terms of being accused by the Russians of propping up colonialist, overtly colonialist forces. That's one reason why they give military support to the French, but there's no way in which they would have intervened in Indochina. So when it comes to Egypt, and what we haven't mentioned, of course, up to this point is oil as well. That they don't want to antagonise the British. Have their oil interests. The Americans have their oil interests, particularly in Saudi Arabia. So the Americans, they don't want to antagonise their partners like the Saudis, and at the same time they don't want to be seen as propping up anti-colonial forces. So Nasser knows this. The Egyptians know this. They're pretty shrewd, and they know that the Americans aren't going to intervene. Right? So that's another reason for playing for time. So you've got this situation in the summer of 1956 where whenever anything's proposed or various sort of diplomatic initiatives, the Egyptians play along with it, but at the same time, highly publicized, the British and the French are engaged in putting together a task force in the Mediterranean, which potentially could intervene. But of course, the very fact that they're doing that in terms of international opinion, outside of sort of, loyal sort of supporters like the Australians and the New Zealanders, doesn't reflect well. It doesn't reflect well inside the Commonwealth with, say, the Indians and the Pakistanis. So that's the scenario that you've got. Back briefly to Mountbatten. Mountbatten, on the night that the chiefs of staff gather in Downing Street, suggests rapid intervention, a coup de main. that, the Royal Marines would take port side, and that there would be a beachhead created, literally a beachhead created, and that then there could be further intervention. And the other chiefs of staff, including a very significant figure, Gerald Templer, who had made his reputation in Malaya, turned around, and because the first thing the army thinks of is Arnhem, and he said, no way, Ducky Dick, no way. And Eden says, why not? He says, and the RAF and the army say it's a crazy idea, that, and it would take at least 6 weeks for us to put together any sort of force that could relieve any advanced guard inside at the north part of the Suez Canal. And Mountbatten turns round and says, yeah, you're absolutely right. They're right. But of course, over the years subsequently, he'd tell all sorts of different stories about that. But in essence, by the end of the evening, so we're into the sort of early hours of the next day with various military officials and diplomats and things. Basically, the British have decided that they've got to talk to the French. The French send someone over almost immediately, very senior delegation, that they've got to put together a task force with the French, and that they've got to threaten the Egyptians that if they don't play game, then steps will be taken for military intervention. And as I say, meanwhile, the Egyptians have worked out, let them carry on. It's not going to reflect well on them, and we'll do everything we can to put off any sort of task force setting sail.
So in terms of, you've talked already about the international reaction. So let's kind of take it through to the plan that is eventually developed, because the French, the Brits and the Israelis all end up working together on a war plan to retake the canal and kind of create a fait accompli to the fait accompli that you were mentioning earlier. So what's the initial plan?
Right. Well, first of all, it's Anglo-French, because you mentioned the Israelis. The French... So up until that point, the Israelis are mainly sort of seen as a sort of pariah, really, seen by the British. The British have got, you need long memories to look back to the sort of final days of the Mandate in Palestine, and, the role of sort of militant Israeli groups like Stern Gang. So there's no love lost between the British military and the British government generally and the Israelis, right? So that they're very much kept at a distance as far as the British are concerned. But that contrasts with the French, that the French go through a very, very rapid period of modernization of their kit, especially their aircraft, and that's very expensive, and they need to sell abroad. And the people who are more than happy to buy their kit are the Israelis, right? And that's why historically, when you look at the Israeli Air Force, you see, Dassault Mirages and subsequent generations, that the French-Israeli links were very, very close. They certainly weren't for the British and the Israelis, exactly the opposite. And the British had various treaties to protect their Middle East allies from Israeli aggression. Most especially Jordan. Now, there'd been a sort of, because the Jordan King Hussein had sought to, at least in public, distance himself from Britain in this news, there'd been a certain sort of tension very recently between the Eden government and the Jordanians. But at the end of the day, the British were, by treaty, committed to protecting Jordan from Israel. So if the British were going to go to war with anybody at the start of 1956, it would be the Israelis. And that led to all sorts of problems subsequently, because, at one point there was a fear that the British might find themselves in conflict with the Egyptians and with the Israelis at the same time in various sort of complex diplomatic games that were played. But of course, as it transpired, the preparations continue across the summer. The French have as I sort of indicated earlier, they have a permanent delegation in Whitehall with liaising on the task force one of the problems, of course, is that going back to at least the Second World War, before that, the British don't trust the French. They think that they're a security risk, and so just like in the Second World War, there were lots of times when they didn't tell the Free French what was going on. Although by various means de Gaulle usually did know. Then similarly in 1956, they don't give the French a sort of full information until late on exactly what their plans are. So it's really problematic, the Anglo-French relationship. But then as you get into the autumn of 1956, by which time the British are more and more committed to something happening, because despite it's actually looking like there could be a settlement at the United Nations in Egypt's favour. So Eden is getting more and more distraught over this, and then suddenly the French come up with this secret proposal, known only to a very small number of politicians and officials, that actually the British should come over to France and meet some interesting people in a villa in Sèvres. And of course, those interesting people are David Ben-Gurion, the Israeli Prime Minister, Moshe Dayan, the sort of legendary chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, and in two meetings in France, the first one, which involved Selwyn Lloyd, the British Foreign Secretary, they come up with this plan whereby the Israelis will attack across the Sinai Peninsula, just as they've done previously, that they'll race across the Sinai Peninsula and to the Suez Canal. And the British and the French will release an ultimatum. And that ultimatum is that both forces, the Egyptians on the Suez Canal, ready to defend their sovereignty, and of course, don't forget at this point, the Egyptians have already, the Israelis will have occupied a large part of Israel because they've occupied the Sinai Peninsula. And the Israelis they must both pull back. So, significant distance from the canal, to create, if you like, a neutral zone. Because if the Israelis pull back, then they're just pulling back from further into territory they've already crossed from Israel. If the Egyptians pull back, they're pulling back within their own territory. So it's clear that this will be unacceptable to Nasser. It would be a humiliation. Why would he do that? So it's they're bound to provoke a crisis. So what the British and the French say that if you don't intervene within the deadline, then we will intervene as a peacekeeping force, Anglo-French peacekeeping force, to regain control of the Suez Canal, because it's bound to be threatened by all of this. And the other thing, of course, which the British in particular have been hammering at throughout the summer, but convincing nobody, is that the Egyptians are incapable of running the canal. Whereas the Egyptians clearly are capable of running the canal, so then they have to add a rider. Well, they're incapable of running the canal in a military situation, so that's why we need to get back there. So that's the idea. Right? So of course everything has to be timed perfectly, particularly the dispatch of the task force from Malta and it meeting up with French ships. Everything has to be timed so it looks to the wider world that the British really and the French really are intervening, that they, so what you can't have is a task force that's dispatched, then your ultimatum's released, and then you say, well, we're going to, but actually your task force already there. So it's all done under dead of night and secrecy, and the task force do leave Malta before the deadline period is up. And this, of course, by now we're into October and November 1956, and it's right at the point where the clearly could have been a settlement agreed at the United Nations, and Selwyn Lloyd is brought back from New York And as I say, he becomes involved in this. So the task force is dispatched, and the French troops come from Algeria. So these are, as I said earlier, not the sort of people you'd want to sort of bump into late on a Saturday night, right? So they're the veterans of years fighting in Indochina, culminating in Dien Bien Phu. They've now spent the last couple of years in Algeria fighting the FLN. So these are really tough cookies who, they jump out of aircraft at 400 feet and all this sort of stuff, and they land in Port Fouad, which is the port of which is often forgotten, on the east bank of the Suez Canal. And then the British, the Marines come off aircraft carriers. So it's a first airborne assault. And Mountbatten's particularly proud of that because he's a sort of pioneer of this. And parachute regiment, paratroopers land at Port Said Airport and then have to fight their way into the town. So what it boils down to is that the French take Port Fouad very, very quickly, and it takes much longer for the British. And then because the French are so ruthless, they don't really have any trouble in Port Fouad because they're as brutal and as violent as they are in Algeria, whereas the British try to, because they're very aware of their sort of image, they try to maintain at least a degree of sort of order and control. And then they wait to go down. The idea then is that they'll make their way down to Ismailia and on to take control or regain control of the canal zone, and the French are really waiting to go. But of course, meanwhile, the Americans are intervening. So, and forget about special relationships. First of all, they're responsible for the Security Council and where it's vetoed, but then crucially within the General Assembly, where a motion of condemning Anglo-French intervention is condemned. The Americans are behind this all the way; they support it. So there's that, but they're also putting heavy financial pressure on the British, right? So there's a run on the pound. Reserves are just draining away. It's a major economic crisis, and what the Americans say to the British is, look, if you agree to a ceasefire, if you agree to a United Nations peacekeeping force coming in, if you agree to withdraw your forces, then we will do all we can to support Sterling. We will give you financial support. We'll end the crisis, and hopefully a degree of normality can be restored. And the British in the Egypt committee, the appropriate cabinet committee, eventually recognise that they've got no choice. Right? So the irony of this is the person who's been the most hawkish in Eden's cabinet is Harold Macmillan, who is the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And as Harold Wilson once famously said of Macmillan, first in, first out, because he's been the person who's been most vocal in calling for military intervention, and he's the person who produces the reality check for the rest of the cabinet committee and the cabinet as a whole, and says we have no choice. We have to agree to what the Americans say. So at that point, Eden picks up the telephone, calls Guy Mollet and says, we've accepted American terms for a United Nations intervention, a ceasefire, and an eventual withdrawal of forces, and you're going to have to do the same.
What is the public response to all of this?
Well, that's a really, really good question, because in Britain and in France, there's a considerable degree of support. So attention today tends to focus on famous sort of demonstrations like the speech that Aaron Bevan gave in Trafalgar Square, which is very powerful and very funny. But actually, across the country as a whole, there was until very late on, there was a surprising degree of support for British intervention, rally around the flag and our boys and all this sort of thing. It's only right towards the end, particularly, of course, after the Labour Party comes out strongly in opposition, that the opinion begins to shift quite significantly. So there's a famous television broadcast that Eden makes on the eve of British intervention. I'm a man of peace. I've always been a man of peace. And then justified action. And Hugh Gaitskell, the leader of the Labour Party, demands a right of response. And it's powerful from Gaitskell because in the first instance, he was quite supportive of government sort of indignation at the fact that the canal zone had been taken over, the canal had been taken over. But by this point, is heavily opposed to military intervention, and Gaitskell makes a very forceful speech. And so there's no equivocation, there's no division in the Labour Party now, and there's also a famous intervention in the press on a Sunday from the Observer, where the Observer comes out against the grain of most of the British press, powerfully opposed to opposition. And while in the short term the Observer circulation dropped, it's now regarded as being, again, an important intervention in Fleet Street, and it began to send signals of the way in which opinion would begin to shift. In France, it didn't. In France, there remained huge indignation. And then now, of course, the target is as much perfidious Albion as it is the Egyptians, that the French eventually have no option but to pull out. But they blame it all on the British. And there are consequences of that, really important consequences after Suez for British and French foreign policy. And we might want to come back to that in a moment or two.
So you've kind of touched on already that this doesn't go down particularly well globally, not least with the Americans and the run on the pound. Is there any indication that the British and the French had kind of thought about how the international community was going to respond before going in? Because you've got to think, Eden, 3 times a foreign secretary, surely he should have had a better handle on this.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. And within the Foreign Office, there's clearly a considerable groundswell of opinion that's opposed to this. And a significant number of very senior officials contemplate resignation, but are under pressure, often from opponents of government policy, outside Whitehall, not to do so. And even more so than within the Colonial Office, the Commonwealth Office, that because they recognise that the biggest damage to Britain is within the Commonwealth. And, there's much things in Pakistan leaving the Commonwealth. Later, of course, Pakistan does leave the Commonwealth temporarily. And in India, Nehru is very, very vocal. And, of course, with the non-aligned group, which is effectively led by Tito and in Yugoslavia and by Nehru in India, is a very, very, by this stage, very powerful sort of global force, and wholeheartedly condemnatory of what appears to be, another example of imperialist aggression by the British. So in terms of global opinion, the British and French really suffer. It's only, as I said earlier, only the Britain's closest allies in the Commonwealth, Australia and New Zealand. The Canadians, as you might expect, are opposed to it. Hey, can't you guys talk about it? Sort yourselves out. So the Canadians are opposed to it. The Australians very, very vocal, but within the Australian government there's deep divisions, but that's another story.
So how does the Suez crisis end, and what's the longer term fallout?
Okay, well, as I say, there is a ceasefire, and then, of course, this is fine for the Egyptians because the Egyptians are going to maintain their control of the canal. There is an issue by now with ships that have been sunk in the canal, and Mountbatten is in his element at this point because he feels vindicated insofar as he said all along to Eden that the Commonwealth would, on the whole, would be opposed to this. So he's sort of feeling sort of smug in that respect. But at the same time, the Navy has come out of this sort of just purely in military terms rather well. So one of the things which they'd managed to survive was remarkable aggression by the American Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean as the task force had made its way to Egypt, and there were various other aspects where the Navy and the Marines had come out of this as well. So he's feeling quite smug about this. And at this point, Mountbatten says, "Well, to Eden, tell the Americans and the UN that we, the Royal Navy, have the requisite expertise to clear the canal." Well, that doesn't go down too well with the Americans or with the United Nations. They say, "Hold on a minute, let's get this straight. You are the guys who create this crisis, and you're the people who, in effect, have made the mess. And now you're saying you'd like all the glory of being seen responsible for clearing it. No. The United Nations will take responsibility for this. So, just all you need to do is leave as soon as you can." So the British do leave, and they leave at night because they're very worried about being, marching out and being attacked by Egyptians or whatever. So the British leave over at night. The French are appalled by this, and so as you might expect, they leave with the Marseillaise blazing and the flags unfurled and a military parade and all the rest of it.
They're used to getting humiliated, aren't they?
Well, no, these people aren't. No, see, these people aren't. And that's one of the great myths. You're falling into the British myth about the French military.
No, it's not. Don't ruin it for me.
They're not at all. Because, one of the things you say about Indochina is, okay, so it ended largely because of one spectacularly inept general, Navarre. It ended in catastrophe at Dien Bien Phu. But the other question you have to ask is, why did it last for so long? And actually, French counterinsurgency techniques, and, let's not defend these in any way because they're extraordinarily brutal, were actually very successful. So it's just that the Viet Minh were even more successful in the end, right? And they go back to Algeria, and the FLN don't technically win the war. They just create a situation where it drags on for so long that they know they're a bit like Nasser, play the long game, And in fact, what happens was that the French go back to Algeria, and then you get the very famous Battle of Algiers. And if you've ever seen the Pontecorvo's magnificent film, you will sort of know, if you haven't seen it, you should do, that actually it's incredibly important in 1957, the struggle between the Algerians and the French. And technically the French win by, they secure control of Algiers, but it's the classic case of you win the battle but you lose the war, right? So that's what happens for the French. They go back. And the other thing, as far as the French are concerned, and this is the big contrast between the French and the British, is that the French, and this is before de Gaulle comes to power, so we're still in the Fourth Republic, right? The French say never again. Never again, okay? We're not going to be dependent on the Americans. Okay, so, people associate the French independent nuclear deterrent with de Gaulle, the force de frappe, but in fact, it's before de Gaulle comes to power. And it's the French socialist prime minister, Guy Mollet, who initiates the nuclear program. And then the Fifth Republic take it over. And reinforce that deep suspicion of the Americans. So that's the path the French are going on. From now on, we're on our own, and we certainly won't be dependent upon the Americans. And but the British do exactly the opposite. And Mountbatten's really important here, because the British recognise that they have to restore Anglo-American relations as speedily as possible. And of course, they have the advantage of the Eisenhower being in office in the White House. So they play on the the legacy of the war. These are all people who obviously became very close to each other in the course of the war. So Macmillan, who succeeds Eden in January 1957, his priority in terms of foreign policy is restoring relations with Eisenhower. And Macmillan and Eisenhower have been very close in the Mediterranean before Eisenhower went back to oversee Operation Overlord. So they're very, very close. And of course, someone who's during the war and subsequently proved brilliant at massaging American egos as well as his own, and shaking hands and working the room, is Mountbatten. So Mountbatten, even before the crisis, back from the minute he becomes First Sea Lord, recognised that the future for the submarine service is nuclear. And so he's already working with the sort of shakers and movers in the United States Navy, people like Admiral Rickover, the sort of father of American nuclear submarines, to secure technology, American technology, to build nuclear-powered submarines, following in the wake, literally in the wake of the first American submarine, the Nautilus, to build a British equivalent. Now, that later, of course, expands into the whole question about the independent nuclear deterrent, and that being submarine-based. But at that point, that's for the future, because still in 1956, 1957, it's based on a V-bomber force. Right? So we might be needing American nuclear technology to do with warheads and things like that. But at this point, it's still largely a British genuinely independent nuclear deterrent force. So, looking to the Navy, that's going to come in the future. But looking to the Americans in terms of actually nuclear propulsion, that's absolutely crucial. And looking to the Americans in, all sorts of other areas of military and diplomatic collaboration, because of course the Cold War is still on. That's crucial. So, if you like, remaking this ostensibly special relationship special is the absolute priority. So that's, as I say, in stark contrast to the French.
Adrian, this has been an absolute tour de force. It always is whenever we speak to you on a topic. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been great.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. It's a pleasure. Thanks, Alex.
Don't forget that we do exist on Patreon as History Hack and on Patreon as well, which is Podbean's own version. Alina and I have had massive fun doing this in 2020, but life is going to change quite a lot next year, and we're going to actually have to go and earn a living, etc. If we want to keep up the regularity that we've been bringing you and the kind of guests that we've been bringing you and the workload, then we will need your help. So if you join, there's going to be incentives for joining on either of those platforms. We're revamping ourselves on both of them. So don't forget to go in. You can do as little as $1 a month, and it all goes towards keeping up History Hack as regular as we've been able to bring it to you this year.
When our guests join us to talk about their work and their new book, the 45 minutes or so they spend with us is just a taster of all their efforts. So to this end, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org. where you can find our guests' latest and greatest books. You can support them, and you can support History Hack too. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep at it and bring you more amazing guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/hack history, or just search on bookshop.org for us under the shops bit. Thank you for your continued support, and here's to your next great